Thank you very much for the invitation. I would have loved to be with you in Munich, but I had COVID a few weeks ago, and for that it's not possible. I brought you a presentation that we can see hopefully within the next half an hour or 40 minutes. And I've prepared a paper on growing on wounds, resilience, and post-traumatic maturation, and I hope that fits into your discussion, and we will see. If anything is unclear, you can interrupt. Otherwise, I'll speak until the end, and then we go into the discussion with one another. My paper has 3 points. The first is black holes, blank spaces, and trauma as linguistic vessel for an orientation on the trauma discourse, which might be new for you. And the second part is traumics, which is a new word, a combination of from comic and trauma. And I'd like to show you on a very special example the effects of trauma on personality in comic book format. And last not least, I'm asking with you, hopefully growing from wounds, resilience, and post-traumatic maturation. First step, black holes, blank spaces, and trauma as linguistic vessel. Trauma is a brief term for a complex phenomenon, a linguistic vessel for experiences that can hardly be put into speech. It originates in the seafaring language of ancient Greece and is most often translated as wound, but can also mean hole or leak, loss and defeat. Thus in itself metaphorically referring to the gap and conceptual intangibility associated with the phenomenon. Nowadays, it is mainly used as a terminological construct for physical and psychological phenomena which can phenomenologically be observed, but hardly narrowed down to a singular concept, and which must therefore be investigated under a multitude of perspectives. This vagueness has made trauma a permanent guest in literature and in the everyday vernacular beyond the clinical context, which in turn needs to draw from literary examples to come to terms with its specific unrepresentability. Trauma itself is an untouchable area, even if it leaves physical traces. As a past historical occurrence, it is present in its long-lasting consequences, which not only affect the individual but can also have a collective or transgenerational dynamic. As future occurrence, it is present potentially, anytime, anywhere, and to any one of us. However, there is no trauma as such, only traumatogenic events that may cause trauma consequences. There's the specific, individually varying experience and reception of these events, and there are theories, concepts, and models that seek to illuminate the interplay of event and experience. Finally, there are multitudes of personal narratives that articulate the unspeakable after the fact. And ideally, these would form a trauma narrative that could mend the hole ripped by the trauma. But the trauma itself remains a shapeless but all the more gaping wound, untouchable and incomprehensible. Traumatic experiences are events with an immense destructive power that threatens one's existence. They penetrate those affected from outside, shake their understanding of themselves and the world, bring the external world out of joint and the inner space out of balance. They can build up sequentially and cumulatively over time, but usually they come suddenly and unexpectedly. So it is not possible to be prepared for them or defend oneself against them. They are boundary violations flooding the ego, disturbing the distinction between inside and outside, tied to experiences that are difficult to understand and can hardly be conceptualized. Basically, you even have to say that they are neither events nor experiences, because the possibility of verbalizing of what has happened, of symbolizing it, expressing it, and storing it as a memory is itself reaching its limits. This is why one speaks of an adversity, in German Widerfahrenes or Erleidnis, that can affect anyone as an accident, attack, rape, war, and persecution, and which confronts us with the unavailability of life, Unverfügbarkeit, as the Marburg theologian Rudolf Bultmann would say, and one's own transience. Trauma research has developed at precisely such stations. It begins in the middle of the 19th century with the invention of the railway as the world's first mechanical means of mass transport. It continues with hysteria research, the phenomenon of war tremors in the First World War, the Holocaust, and the phenomenon of sexual violence, until finally the Vietnam veterans are responsible for it, ensure that the first official diagnostic tool for post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, was found in 1918. A wide range of phenomena that are essentially connected by the fact that they are events of extraordinary threat with catastrophic proportions that would trigger profound despair in almost everyone. The main criteria of PTSD include persistent states of hyperarousal and avoidance attitudes that make the trauma a foreign body, ein Fremdkörper, in one's own life, a sore spot that cannot be touched and cannot become part of one's own biography. The attitude to life is determined by the impression nothing is the same anymore. Strengths that were believed to be safe seem lost, resources closed, and life's path divided. This is also related to the narrative processes that are blocked by the traumatic event and dismantle the ability of those affected to report on their experience and to feel a coherent sense of meaning. A central feature of trauma is speechlessness, the inability to recount the event and to come to terms with it or to cope with it through the process of reporting and understanding. Traumatic events are experienced, but not experienced as part of the self. They leave behind a destruction of form and structure that prevents the event from being represented and understood in a coherent manner. Its classification in a temporal, spatial, or causal context is not possible. Memories of the trigger appear fragmented, like fragments that do not fit into an overall picture. If the event is addressed anew through certain triggers and is re-experienced in the form of intrusions or as flashbacks and nightmares, this happens in a here and now feeling that allows the past event to be experienced as if it is now and prevents inner distancing. The intrusions are perceived as repetitions of a terror that has broken into life and continues to determine everyday life. The emotional world appears foreign and hostile, or numb and dull. Those affected feel cut off from joy and sadness, but also alienated from people close to them who did not experience the event and hope that the traumatized person will quickly heal and get back to business as usual. But time does not heal all wounds, and trauma does not wear away on its own. If an attempt is made to define it as done and put it aside unprocessed, for example, if it is ignored, repressed, or trivialized, this usually does not result in it disappearing over time. That we are currently talking so much about trauma is not self-evident. The American psychotherapist and trauma scholar Judith Herman sees the research into psychological trauma as a history of resistance with periodic amnesia. Phases of intense research are repeatedly followed by phases in which the topic is forgotten, becomes taboo, and understanding in society dwindles. Trauma research is therefore characterized by periodic ups and downs. This involves economic, political, and insurance interests, but also defense mechanisms that are tied to the subject of the investigation itself. Against this background, the introduction of PTSD can be seen as the successful implementation of a framework concept. Even if it does not cover all subsequent disorders, it has brought the topic out of the taboo zone and made it clear that psychological trauma is a worldwide phenomenon that urgently needs to be treated. Since 1991, psychotraumatology has been institutionalized as a separate scientific discipline. It understands trauma at a critical distance from psychoanalysis as a reaction to an extremely destructive event that occurs objectively from outside, is neither desired nor fantasized, and for whose treatment separate therapeutic approaches have been developed. These can point to good results, but the healing success is uncertain, and the caesura associated with the trauma remains present as a scar. The patient's desire for everything to go back to the same way it was before the trauma is understandable, but inappropriate. So therapy goals include realistic adaptation to the changed situation and acceptance of the loss. Traumatic events also have a social dimension. They confront us with the cruel aspects of our coexistence, with the dark sides of our order, and with the truth that no one wants to know, that our lives are fragile and the world is a dangerous place where people want to torture and exterminate other people, and that in the extreme, a single incident of violence is enough to destroy a person mentally. In this way, they point beyond the individual possibilities of recovery to the pathology of reality, die Pathologie der Realität, which determines with its underlying influence the coexistence across generations and will not be eliminated from the world completely. In 2018, the Hamburg Museum of Art and Industry presented works by Syrian artist Khaled Barakeh as part of the Days of Exile. Barakeh, who was born in Damascus in 1976, deals with political power structures, torture, flight, and exile, and the long-term consequences of armed conflicts in his works and long-standing social injustice. He completed a degree in painting on the Faculty of Fine Arts in Damascus and a Master of Fine Arts in Denmark before coming to Germany in 2013. Today he lives in Berlin. There he noticed how the effect of terrible reports was wearing off and how the eyes of media users became accustomed to the horror. How the many images of the war become common, cause people to become numb and stop looking, while the war actually continued and its reality remained as an internal reality for himself and a permanently unfinished past for those affected. How would it be possible to break this numbness and awake empathy in those who live far away from the horror? For this effect, Barakeh created his untitled images and showed them to the public in the exhibition in Hamburg. The images show the horror of loss. People who just a moment away have lost someone, a child, and who are still holding the dead in their arms. The artist worked with photo templates that documented the war in Syria. Barakeh cut the bodies of the deceased out of the picture, almost scratching them out of the photographs in such a way that only their silhouette remained visible as a white spot, concealing the identity of the victims to protect their dignity. In this way, the series The Untitled Images draws attention to the survivors who have to learn to live with the loss, while at the same time showing the brutal reality of war and the cruelty of the political regime, but also the violence that comes from the act of showing through the media. The white blank space can be interpreted as a representation of the unrepresentable, and thus as a representation of trauma. It marks the gap, the hole, the sore spot that survivors hold in their hands and that will accompany their lives from now on. When I saw this picture for the first time, I immediately understood it as a visualization of what we call trauma. 4 years earlier, in 2014, I had completed my habilitation in Kiel, as you have heard, with a thesis Ein Hauch von Ordnung, a touch of order, which against resistance introduced the topic of trauma into the field of German language practical theology with a qualification thesis, and took up the professorship in Marburg in 2018. In Marburg, the trauma theme was already predetermined by 2 innovative works, by Ruth Poser's dissertation on Ezekiel and by Christina Augst's studies on sexualized violence in the church, both published in 2012. And so it makes sense to network the topic across disciplines and to organize a international interdisciplinary conference in 2022, and we were lucky to get Barake's image as the cover image, therefore. Because when we are looking for a cover image for this volume, Barake's image came back to my mind, for it symbolizes the unresolved task of defining trauma more closely as a hermeneutic construct, and then conveys the hope that there could be a third, creative possibility between the everything and nothing that so often determines life for those affected, by making visible through the blank space what our eyes have become so accustomed to through the many images that it is not longer seen. I felt the power and the powerlessness of the survivors at the same time. The tremendum et fascinosum, as Rudolf Otto would say. Everything that finds a linguistic vessel in the Greek word trauma. A vessel that can never really be grasped, but rather raises the question of how the phenomena that are stored in it can be read, understood, and accompanied in an ethically appropriate way, if they can be understood at all. At the same time, Barake's image surprisingly refers to a Christian framework, and maybe you have discovered it already, because here you can see it as our cover. It reminds us to the traditional Pietà, and shows it anew by defamiliarization, durch Verfremdung. You can see the Mother of Sorrows with the body of Jesus in her womb, if you compare the pictures again. The result is something like creation through loss, as my Catholic colleague Hildegund Keule would say, following the French philosopher Georges Bataille. But such creative sublimation and artistic achievement presupposes loss. It is neither to be expected or demanded. It does not make up for suffering. It does not undo the loss, and it does not eliminate suffering from the world, as Christians in particular are so often tempted to believe. As a linguistic and cultural expression, trauma stands for extreme experiences of violence that people have experienced in relation to their environment, so that it can also overlap with other discourses, such as vulnerability or resilience. It has individual and collective dimensions and stands for incisions in the life stories of individuals as well as for caesuras in societies invoked by historical catastrophes. Trauma narratives can be understood as echoes of such events, which are difficult for individuals to express, but which, in literary form, via the detour of culture, open up a collective space of expression, lamentation, processing, and remembrance, which has a constructive effect without cancelling out the loss. And such an echo, such a detour, I would like to show to you in the second chapter. Traumics, the effects of trauma on personality in comic book format. The portmanteau word traumics encompasses the content and form of trauma and comic and merges them into a new genre. The subjects discussed here, extreme historical events such as the Holocaust, themes such as flight and forced migration, as well as the processing of childhood traumas, show that comics and graphic novels that tackle trauma are not just a subgenre of popular culture, but are perfectly suited for bringing traumatic experience to light, supplementing blows of fate, and playing a role in historical research and education at school and in the parish. They raise the reader's awareness and compel them to careful reading, thus providing a valuable contribution to how taboo subjects are perceived and processed in society. Their potential lies in their ability to combine factual and fictional content and in a form and language with room for both the visualized and the hidden, that which can be expressed and that which seems unutterable. They place the suffering into a temporal spatial framework while leaving room for filmic, disjointed, fragmented expressions in the same way that traumatic events are typically experienced, and they simplify complex circumstances and overwhelming emotions in an appropriate way. Against the background of multiple cases of sexual abuse by church personnel, this contribution explores the traumatic special range of expression in the area of religious taboo subjects and is centered around the comic Why I Killed Peter, warum ich Pater Pierre getötet habe. Its imaginative combination of words and images can make the perspective of the abused child visible and show the manipulative way the moment of abuse is prepared. And maybe you can see it at the first sight here on the cover. How many faces can you see?
Obviously, two. Maybe there are more. Yeah. Two are obvious.
There are two personalities combined. The victim with the sharp nose and the black face, and the perpetrator with the red hair bound together. So this is a symbol how the personality of the victim experienced something like the invasion of the self by the perpetrator, and that the two are sticked together after the abuse, and how difficult it is for the victim to get rid of the other person in one's own personality, and that I'd like to show to you now. Why I Killed Peter was published in 2006 in France and translated into German in 2008. It tells the story of a case of sexual boundary violation, which also took place a long time ago in a church setting. An individual case, a case in which the life of an individual falls to pieces in a single night. Okay, we go back. The boy, the victim, his name is Olivier, and he is 12 years old. For the third time in succession, he accompanies Pater Pierre on the holiday camp, But this time something is different. Pater Pierre has brought a dog with him, a wolf-like creature in a black-red coat with yellow eyes and a panting tongue. A harbinger of hell housed at the gate of the holiday camp and frightening the living daylights out of the boy. Pater Pierre, well acquainted with the boy, quickly noticed Olivier's fear of the dog, looking him in the face and with forefinger raised the promises that he needed to be not to be afraid. Don't worry. Don't worry, he is fine. He is very friendly with everyone who is with me. He'd never hurt a friend of mine. To prove his point, he invites Olivier to come with him on long walks. He insists that the boy accompanies him and takes the dog by the lead. This is a privilege, as he says. Sure enough, the boy loses his fear and feels proud and special, the chosen one. Indeed, he is and has been for longer than he can imagine, and for purposes other than he believes, by a wolf in a sheep's clothing. The walks with the dog are part of the grooming process by which the abuser attempts to inveigle themselves into the confidence of their victim by flattering and wooing them like a groom, by being attentive, rewarding and spoiling them until the moment the assault becomes possible. In this case, the walks are followed by the beach by an exclusive ride on a bus, and the bus by a night, which changes everything. One of the special achievements of the book is to show the loneliness of the child without revealing exactly what has befallen him, and thereby not reducing his story to this single sequence. The abuse forms the center of the book, but the book is not limited to this assault. It recounts the before and the after and illustrates in a carefully composed symbolic language how everything is connected. It pursues the developing entanglements chronologically over 11 chapters. It starts when Olivier is 7 years of age and ends on the 21st June in 2004, the first day of summer. A certain rhythm is given to the chapters with headings which answer the book title, I Killed Peter Because I Am 7, 8, 9, and so on until 35 years old. The closing image is dated on July the 16th and shows the 11 Oliviers united in a group picture at peace with themselves, and I show it later on. This is the little Olivier. Olivier's parents do not go to church. They are a so-called alternative family and an open marriage. Parents sleep with other partners. The grandparents, on the other hand, belong to a bigoted Catholic world. Pater Pierre, but it could be any church at all. It doesn't matter to be Catholic in this part. Pater Pierre connects the two worlds. He is the link between the two opposites. He joins that which is tearing the boy apart, a friendly, uncomplicated man brought into the parental home by the grandparents when Olivier is 9 years old. They can all agree about him, even though little is known about him. Pater Pierre is a priest, but without a cassock. He comes from nowhere and stays for years, a bulky man wearing shirts and jeans, the profuse beard, hairy paws, and a furry body, and a winning grin from ear to ear, as you have seen here. Pater Pierre does not speak about God and the church. He is not a missioner. He builds up relationships, but that is exactly where he shows his double face, which is expressed here in form of a cat, and the victim becomes a mouse haunted by the cat. What are the consequences? The perpetrators of sexual violence are empathetic and patient. They make contracts, build relationships, and pave the way for their deeds. They feel their way in and they know the best baits. They manipulate, desensitize, and ignore what is put in their way in terms of barriers. They show their two faces, sensitive and brutal. They can disguise and deceive, can fascinate people and generate sympathy. In this way, they use their empathy as means to prepare the deed and show themselves to be gross and vicious as soon as they have achieved their aim. They are seldom discovered and brought to justice, whereas the victim has a long road of consequences ahead of him. The perpetrator disappears from the story. The comic Why I Killed Peter also asks the question how one is to live with such a completely impossible story, as Kathy Carruth would put it, stamped on one's being. How one is to come alive again after someone has killed something of inside, and how one can overcome the evildoer inside without needing to kill him in reality. The book can take advantage of the genre-specific means of expression to make visible in a parallel way, and we can see it here, what is normally only tellable in sequence. The overwhelming complexity of post-traumatic consequences and the speechlessness which accompanies the trauma. The destructive effect is described in the second part of the book. As the boy grows up, has other sexual experiences, marries, becomes a father, and yet cannot rid himself of the abuser and the abuse. The trauma does not go away of its own accord. It haunts Olivier in the form of depression, aggression, sleeping problems, nightmares, and effects on the body. It comes back as a sense of dissociation, displacement, and a weakening of the whole personality. The church is a particularly powerful trigger. It brings flashbacks so that Olivier is dragged into the here and now of the trauma. And when Olivier's daughter is 12 years old as he was at the time of the deed, he wakes up from his dreams crying uncontrollably and with the feeling of having lost something, someone important, a part of himself. Why I Killed Peter is an autobiographical novel. Olivier Carr is the barely veiled pseudonym of the French author Olivier Carrali, born in Lebanon in 1976. Carrali tells his own story here, and it is the telling of it which brings the lost self back until all fragmented and splintered parts of Olivier are standing smiling next to each other in the final image. In such a way, but it's a way to go, as we can see now. Writing is the means by which the events can be banished from inside the person. He says, it's high time to write the whole story down from beginning to end. There is no other way to get rid of it. I am lucky in that I can beat it by writing about it. It is as effective as psychoanalysis and saves a lot of money. So I dive into my memories. But over and above a textual rendering of the trauma, it is the medium of the comic which permits a vivid portrayal of being the story home to its readers. This process is described in the final chapter of the book. Olivier is now 35 years old. He has reached the point at which he can confront his own story. He writes it out of his system in a painful process and afterwards finds a real friend, Alfred, who is a comic artist and willing to work with a story. Olivier tells him what happened, and Alfred offers to visualize the stories in images. Both agree this text should be a graphic novel. The decision turns out to be a fortuitous choice in two ways. Firstly, it takes both of them back to where the act of abuse took place in reality. In the camp, they unexpectedly meet the person of Olivier thought during so many chapters he needed to kill. Pater Pierre suddenly appears among the abandoned houses. He is an old man now, just a little old man, bald, with weak hands, over whom Olivier towers. The victim grabs the chance to confront his abuser with the consequences of the deed. In the end, the abuser remains behind, and Olivier can finish this, find closure, and look forward to new times. Thus, paradoxically, that which draws writer and artist together also drives abuser and victim apart. The images in the comic are especially well suited for describing traumatic experience, the splintering of language, the overflowing, overwhelming images, the discrepancy between what one believes one feels and what is actually happening. The confusion and the invasion of the self, fatefully fusing abuser and victim through the enforced intimacy. We can see the abuser, for example, bursting out of the belly of the victim, and upon carefully inspection, the book's cover illustration turns out to be an optical illusion, as we have seen before, containing two faces at the same time. The beard Pierre looking left and the boy with the pointy nose looking right, both enclosed in an almond-shaped eye through which the book invites the reader to look and look carefully. The therapeutic effect of the afflicted author is to be found in the narrative classification of the extreme event. The trauma is assigned a frame, receives space and time, and therefore is placed in the past, so that a future can be possible. For those who see and read the story, the act of reading becomes an act of witnessing. They need to become irritated and need to look carefully. Here you can see the victim trying to spit off the whole impression, and finally all the Oliviers, all the fragmented egos come together, and this is not a happy end, but it's better than before. Last point, growing from wounds, resilience and post-traumatic maturation. Baraki and Pater Pierre can be seen as examples for creation through loss, which brings the trauma discourse in contact with another discourse, resilience. In terms of time, the concept of resilience lags behind the concept of trauma. In the German-speaking world, he remained practically unknown until the 1970s. It is not a German word anyway, and has to be explained before it can clarify anything. In terms of linguistic history, the term is either derived from its Latin root, translated resiliere, as rebounding or jumping back from something, and resilience is understood to be the psychological ability to let events bounce off oneself and thereby prove to be resilient. Or the term is derived from English usage, where the noun resilience means a material property, as elasticity, and the associated adjective resilience stands for a whole bundle of properties with similar connotations such as robust, stable, or elastic. Properties that describe the tolerance of a material to external disturbance and declare it to be durable and indestructible. Applied to the psychological context, resilience means the psychological resilience of a person in certain developmental crises, that stability and inner strength, their ability to remain stable and attentive despite stress and disturbances, to survive blows of fate, to even grow from them, to surpass themselves, and to thrive despite observed circumstances. Stand-up men qualities, Stehaufmännchen-Qualitäten, that were understood at the beginning of research to innate, relatively fixed personality traits, but are now seen as the result of a complex interaction between the person and the environment and can therefore be learned and promoted. The concept of resilience offers a common framework of those areas of research that want to focus attention from deficits of the person's resources and promote them. The central question here is not, why do people get sick? It is, why do people stay healthy despite everything? For example, because they have protective factors such as physical strength, social support, stabilizing values and superego voices, but also characteristics such as self-confidence, intelligence, humor, optimism, and the art of not seeing difficulties as disasters, but rather as problems that can be solved and as challenges that we can grow from. Resilience research emphasizes the constructive characteristics of people and the positive possibilities of situations that, despite all adversities, offer growth potential and allow new things to flourish. Resilience is therefore a value, and it seems generally desirable to have it or to develop it, to train and increase it, and to make it the preventive or aftercare goal of education, training, and therapy. The term also appears correspondingly attractive in theology, religious education, for example, or pastoral care, because it can be connected to religiously based models such as strengthening people and giving hope. Resilience is a counter-term to trauma, which indicates the pathology of reality and the lasting vulnerability of humans. Not just as an exceptional suffering of an individual, but as a basic experience of humans in general. A basic experience that cannot simply be regulated, optimized away, or explained away. Resilience protects traumatized people from being overwhelmed by an experience. It strengthens a competency and resource-oriented attitude, emphasizes the activity and creative power of those affected, and draws attention to what has been successful and to what can still be successful, one's own future life. At the same time, it should not be used as immunization agent, because resilience may help you to cope with injuries, but there is no cure for the fundamental vulnerability of life. The inclusion of the concept of resilience does not belong to the beginning of trauma research. It comes when resilience has already established itself as a separate field of research that started in the 1980s. Since then, trauma has no longer been viewed only as a deficit and from a pathological perspective, but more questions have been asked about what helps people to survive even the most severe blows of fate. In psychotraumatology, resilience is given its own interpretation, primarily as post-traumatic growth, posttraumatisches Wachstum. The concepts of resilience and post-traumatic maturation have developed from different human science issues and research contexts and emphasize different aspects without being able to be fully defined conceptually. The study of post-traumatic maturation or growth processes comes from clinical practice with traumatized people, and therefore, in contrast to resilience, has a direct connection to trauma. But post-traumatic maturation is also a construct. It is based on the observation that some affected people report a positive transformation after a traumatic experience, subjectively find a reinterpretation of the experience, and report personal maturation processes, development of a new self and worldview, increase in knowledge and life wisdom, deepening of relationships, and the attitude to life in general, often in a religious sense. Such resilience can obviously be experienced. It can be told and even partially diagnosed, for example, using the methodological instrument of self-assessment questionnaires. But it can neither be demanded nor generalized. Yes, it is not even self-evident, but contrary to expectations. It also does not automatically go hand in hand with mental health, and it is not always possible to distinguish clearly between construction and illusion when those affected describe the new meanings of their life. Nevertheless, good can come from bad, and there can be an increase in life despite all the disruptions. But the pre-traumatic life does not return. Post-traumatic maturity is not a defense factor in the sense of a bounce or a jump back to a normal state. Maturation remains linked to the experience of the crisis, and the trauma is associated with loss. Whatever may mature, heal, and grow after trauma, the scar remains, as we have learned from Harry Potter and his last sentence, all was well. All was well, but the scar remains. And literature, not only Harry Potter, but literature in general, more than religion perhaps, is the place where one dares to get close to the enemy. Thank you for your attention.
Hi, thank you for this talk. So my name is Amber Griffioen. It's always nice to have a Marburg theologian because like Rudolf Bultmann and Rudolf Otto are going to get name dropped at least once. And I always appreciate that. So yeah, that was great. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more. Well, first of all, just in terms of if you're interested in traumics and so on, I do some work on pregnancy loss, theology of pregnancy loss. And there's a really great book by Jennifer Scurro called The Pregnancy Does Not Equal Childbearing Project. And basically the first half of this, so it's a philosophical treatment, a phenomenological approach to understanding pregnancy loss. But the first kind of half of the book is in the form of a graphic novel. Where she narrates her own experience and kind of brings the reader of the book into the topic in a very different way than you tend to get in a lot of philosophical texts, and then goes on to talk about pregnancy loss in a more kind of structured philosophical sense. So that might be interesting for you going forward.
Can you say the name again, Jennifer?
Jennifer Scurro, S-C-U-R-O.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I haven't heard about it, but I'm collecting these traumics or comics, graphic novels. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. So my question is, especially coming from a theological perspective, thinking about notions of post-traumatic growth as a kind of secular theodicy, and wondering whether that's, first of all, a useful application or an applicable kind of term to thinking about post-traumatic growth, and if so, what problems might arise for it sort of on that very understanding, or if not, if that question doesn't really make sense, then I'd just be curious as to how you would connect discussions about post-traumatic growth to concerns about the problem of suffering and theological reasoning and so on in the theological space. Does that make sense?
I'm not sure if I got the point, but I try. And you can sharpen it in the next step if it's not the thing you wanted to hear. Maybe I try first.
Sure.
What I think is important, that there is a temptation for theologians for the happy end, because we define ourselves from Eastern and not from Karfreitag. And our existence here is more the Kar-Samstag than the Sunday. And that's why I point out, stick a bit to the pathology of reality. I think religion offers a lot, not just trauma narratives in the Bible, for example, but also to offer forms of expressions of lamentations. And it offers having a group or community to share the vulnerability of life. But I think there's the temptation as to think as if it is overcome already here And I don't think that this is true. I'm a Lutheran theologian, and I'd like to say with Martin Luther, the theologian should be a theologian of reality, and not of making false impressions or illusions of having a paradise here on earth. And trauma is a special field, therefore. And I do like the concept of post-traumatic growth too. And there are hints that something like this exists. But most of the people don't feel it. It's just, I don't know it as in percent, but say less than a third of traumatized people experience something like post-traumatic growth. And if you try to force people that something good should come out of the bad, then it's something like Henning Luther, another theologian from our book, named Die Lügen der Tröster, that especially in pastoral care, you are tempted to hear something good because you are not able, as a pastoral caregiver, to contain the bad experience of the other person. And I think this is a great temptation, or a dangerous temptation, actually.
Maybe I can follow up and sharpen this question about theodicy, the theodice, because some theologians thought, John Hicks, and to a certain degree, Eleanor Stump, in her recent book on Wandering in Darkness, that suffering and trauma has the potential of personality growth. And so the existence of suffering is somehow, to a certain extent at least, maybe not like the really big ones like Auschwitz, but the ones we encounter, they are justified because they facilitate personal growth. So God is justified in allowing suffering because only by going through suffering, we develop the depth to find our ultimate relationship, which is our ultimate human goal, into a loving relationship with God. So post-traumatic growth is used in like a anthropocentric or psychological version of theodicy. What's your take on that?
I think a part of this is true, that some kind of deepening feelings of life have to go through suffering. But on the other hand, I think it's tricky. It's tricky to balance that out. It can be heard sarcastically that you have to suffer a lot to have the real life or real connection with God. And what is the role of God? I don't want to have the image of God as someone who, from the outside, like in Hiob, for example, makes experiments with people, how they cope with suffering, to have a good relation with him, some kind of an educator or a trainer or something. I think both sides belong to the topic. But that is part why it is so difficult to find the right words for traumatic events and what comes afterwards. As I pointed out, and that even belongs to the Holocaust, we have the phenomenon that people seeked a new life afterwards, had great families, a very long life. Loads of the victims have become 19 years old and older, and would describe their life in some, despite the Holocaust, as rich and a good life somehow. But I think this is something only the victims themselves could say, and I couldn't say that for them as a theologian. And the rest is silence with Shakespeare.
Yeah, thank you for the great lecture. I'm Sasha Horvat, philosopher. I appreciate the way you show trauma through different media, through photographs, through comics, through stories, and it gave me then I remembered about this book titled "How Societies Remember." I cannot remember the author, but it was a really interesting book. So I was meaning to ask you, in your opinion, how today's society remember trauma that hit maybe majority of populations or certain groups in the populations. How do we now effectively transfer this remembrance of trauma to younger generations?
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very good question. As I have said before, for those who are affected by trauma, it's very hard to say they can really remember it, because when they have trigger, the trauma comes back in this here and now feeling, and it is very hard work, and sometimes it doesn't come to a good result, that trauma becomes part of their past. It always stays part of their present time. But on the other hand, they are part of a society, and the society, or a religious community, for example, a parish, they can offer a space for remembrance, and they can do something the victim himself couldn't do. And culture is this third way, the detour, in which trauma effects and fragmentations can get something like holding and containing, and offer a room of remembrance, or giving the feeling of justice, which is very important to victims. And that wouldn't make things good for their personal life, but in another dimension, so to speak, in a cultural dimension, you can find some kind of resilience here. And this is probably why I like to combine the psychological and medical tools with cultural expressions, as I have done today, because they offer some kind of detour. And religion is such a detour itself. We come from the trauma wound as Christians, and we have the lamentation and the suffering as the cross in the middle of our faith. But unfortunately, by seeing this 2000 years, it gets familiarized and loses its power. So it has to be demonstrated through alienation, like Barake does with the Pietà. I think one of the problems of societies at the moment is that it's very hard to say what we share as cultural tools, especially over generations, because of, last not least, the digitalization. Loads of our normal life, not just the trauma life, is separate, fragmented. And so it's very hard to find and to share a cultural tool which would help to express and to discuss trauma, and not to have the feeling that I'm absolutely alone with my experience. I think that makes it very hard at the moment, even in Western societies who are not involved in war in their own countries at the moment.
Thank you.
Time for one more question. Is there another question? No, then
Sarah Friedman?
Sarah, online question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your talk. It gives me lots to think about because it fits very much with some of the work I'm doing, and these traumics are a new idea for me. So I'm excited to learn more on that. But I wonder if I was thinking about the theologian Shelley Rambo, who does a lot of work in trauma, and her invitation to really focus more on the concept of kind of Holy Saturday as this liminal space when she talks about living in with the consequences of trauma. If that's in some ways a more helpful approach for us than post-traumatic growth, because she says, of course, we jump, especially as theologians, we jump from crucifixion to resurrection. But she said this whole space, which is so strange, that's, she says, but somebody living in the consequence of trauma is in that liminal space. They've gone somewhere that other people can't come. They're not with us. They're not away. They're in a different space that is mysterious and troubling. And I wonder if that in some ways is more helpful, or maybe not more helpful, but a helpful space rather than always jumping to the post-traumatic growth and that invitation to witness, which is always so uncomfortable for others to join in that liminal space.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I have felt inspired by the books of Shelley Rambo myself, and to discover the Holy Saturday for our liturgy, because it's the forgotten day in our calendar. And I think this is kind of typical, that the sore spot and this is a falling out of our remembrance of the Eastern thing, although it gives a special place for the betwixt and between the traumatized people feel so often. And I hope to get Shelley Rambo to Marburg within the next 2 years and to hear herself, because I think this is very inspiring, and it shows that something can grow from even the academic research of trauma and bad events, and then that you can discover your own traditions with a new seeing by that. But this is something we do on in the safe place of our desk, and not in the midst of war. And this is the difference.
Thank you very much. I also wondered if it's possible for us to have a copy of your paper, or if it's published, if we can access it.
Yeah, I have published parts of it, and I can send you the links or the PDFs afterwards if you would like, to Gina.
Thank you very much.
She can give it to you.
Yeah, send it to Gina and she can.
Yeah, I will.
Send it to Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Maike Schult, for your presentation. We know that you had a hard time with very serious COVID infection, so you couldn't come. It doesn't make sense under those circumstances to hope for a speedy recovery, but we hope for a full recovery. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me with you. And I hope it fit, because I would have liked to see more of you as a group and of your discussion. And I hope that you have a good talk after me now, and a good end of the 2 or 3 days you've been together now. Thanks for the intervention, for that workshop, and see you sometime in reality, hopefully.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.